Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we conclude with the three-part series on the book of Esther. I hope you have enjoyed the first two parts. Part one was entitled, Now That is God, where we came to understand that although God is never once mentioned throughout the book of Esther, you see his sovereignty threaded through Esther's life. We saw that God made way for Esther to be crowned queen for his greater purpose of saving his people. Although God is hidden from our view throughout the book of Esther, he is constantly at work behind the scenes. We saw the book of Esther as a call to trust God's providence, even when he seems absent, knowing and believing that God is committed to loving his people. The challenge we took away was to look for God in our lives, acknowledging now that is God. Part two of the series was entitled The Making of a Queen, where we came to understand what it really took for Esther to stand up and rise to her royal position. At the heart of this book was a reminder that there come moments in our lives where we must stand up no matter the cost. This may be through confronting our fears. It may be displaying strength in the face of grief or pain. It may be through believing when things seem dark. It may be acting on what is right. We saw that as women of God, staying silent or waiting for others to act was not an acceptable option. We saw from Esther's beautiful example that we cannot turn fear into faith without falling on our knees in fervent prayer. In times like this, we need more Esthers who choose to do what is right. Esther is a powerful reminder that God values women and their contributions. It takes reliance on him and power through faith in God. We were emboldened to embrace God's calling in our lives. Esther had a beautiful metamorphosis from a passive, compliant young woman who depended on others to think for her into a powerful leader of God's people who displayed courage. Let's recap the story. The book of Esther starts in 484 BC. It is at the height of King Xerxes' Persian Empire, one of the most powerful kingdoms at this time. He was a powerful king and wanted to show all of that off. So he threw a 6-month open house to show all that he had. At the last part, he threw a 7-day banquet, an all-men's banquet, and they could eat and drink with no restrictions. His queen, Queen Vashti, had a separate women's banquet, which sounds very fun to me. And the king was drunk. And he decides that he wanted Queen Vashti to come into his banquet wearing only a crown. In the Jewish books, it was said that she was completely naked. And of course, she refuses to go in, and she gets kicked out of being queen because she refused the king. So he decided to look for beautiful women all throughout the kingdom and go after women who were 13, 14, and 15 years old, beautiful young virgins. Could you imagine this? Could you imagine the horror and the fear that these women must have felt? He just snatched them from their families and from their lives. He stole their innocence. Then they had to go through a 12-month beauty treatment. And Esther was so beautiful that she was rounded up, probably as a young teen, and this is where she comes onto the scene. She was a young Jewish girl. Her real name was Hadassah. And she was exiled from her homeland. Her parents both died. She was an orphan, and she was adopted by her uncle Mordecai. Esther, who was secretly a Jew, was chosen because of her rare beauty. She becomes queen in 479 BC. All the women who were not chosen then became the king's concubines. And here comes the evil villain on the scene, Haman the Agagite. And the Agagites hated the Jewish people. Haman was so hung up on himself that he commanded people to bow down to him. Mordecai would not bow because his loyalty was to God and not to man. Haman was enraged, so he tricked the king into signing an edict to annihilate all the Jews in just one day. Essentially a massive slaughter. Esther's adopted father, Mordecai, informs Esther of Haman's vendetta against the Jews. He tells Esther that she is the only hope for saving the Jewish people. They make a plan for Esther to ask the king for the decree, and Esther was so scared. She had been warned by Vashti's example of what not to do. But Esther goes to God in prayer and fasting. She responds with bravery and says, "If I perish, I perish." At this moment, the story takes a pivot, beginning Haman's downfall in Jewish provision. Esther has two banquets, and it's at the second banquet that she bravely informs the king that she is Jewish. And she informs the king of Haman's edict to kill the Jews. And so the king had Haman executed. The king issues a counter decree then to protect the Jews. The Jews are saved, they triumph over their enemies, and they are rescued from the annihilation. Because of Esther's bravery, the Jews were delivered from destruction. Today, we will see how Esther truly claims her crown and fiercely stands up for God's purpose in her life with strength and dignity. The first thing I want to talk about tonight is purpose through pain. I believe that Esther, in a sense, lost herself. She lost the Hadassah within her. Being taken as a young girl, her innocence stolen by the king, she was challenged by her circumstances. She was beautiful and she didn't completely understand God's purpose in her life. In the beginning of her queenship, she lost focus of who she was. And her purpose slipped from pleasing God to making the king happy. But God chose her anyways, her flaws and all, for God's greater purpose. And God has a purpose for us. For me, I grew up, and I am so grateful to my parents who planted seeds of faith in my heart. And I went to church and was an active part of church, but I can honestly say I never gave God my whole heart. I never gave my whole life to God. In Luke 14:33, it says, "Anyone who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple." And there were parts of my life I was unwilling to give up. Jesus was not on the throne of my heart. I was the Lord of my life. Jesus was not the Lord of my life. The stubbornness of my heart led me to a path of darkness. Like Esther, I lost touch with God and his purpose for my life. I put a lot of emphasis on worldly things like looks and status and my job and my future. And on the outside, my life looked pretty good. I was pursuing a degree in international business. I was in the sorority Alpha Omicron Pi and became the Panhellenic president, the president over the sororities, all the sororities on campus. And I had a job that I loved, but I felt empty. And I believe at that time I was at a Y in the road. I had to make a decision. Although I believe God was trying to get my attention, I didn't listen. In fact, by this time, I was extremely turned off from religion, and I was agnostic, not even knowing if I really believed that Jesus was God, and definitely not wanting to be a part of organized religion. I thought the answer to my life and why I felt empty inside was that I needed to pursue my passion, and my passion was art and apparel design. So I dropped out of college, resigned as president, and moved states to go to fashion school. It was there that, unbeknownst to me, I went soul searching. And I looked for the truth in all different types of places, but I did not want to look to the Bible. I was so skeptical of the Bible because I incorrectly correlated religiosity that I saw with God. And I wouldn't even read the Bible, but I was curious. So I decided, you know what, I'm not going to read the Bible, but I will study the history of the Bible. And that built my faith. And I found that the Bible is absolutely truth. And I want to read this. So I started reading it. I wanted to live according to it. And it was then that I realized, you know what? I really can't do this by myself. I need some support. I need a fellowship. I need a community of like-minded people. And I prayed. I prayed, God, if there's anyone who wants to live a godly life, anyone who's truly striving to follow the Bible, please direct them to me. And I kid you not, it was only a couple days later, I was at work and I met some guys at Starbucks and they invited me to their church. And I was skeptical, but I remembered my prayer. And I went to church and I checked it out with, as I said, very skeptical eyes. But I saw power in these people's lives. That they weren't perfect, they were striving to obey the scriptures. And that moved my heart. And I began to study the Bible to live according to it. And it transformed my life. It wasn't until then that I understood the Bible is meant to be applied to my life, and it's active and it's applicable. It was incredible to see how the Bible could touch any part of my heart. It was there that I realized that in order for me to give my life to God, I needed to face some tough things in my heart. God changed my heart and my life, and I gave my whole life to God, and I was baptized. I had always wondered before that, what is my purpose in life? Why am I on this earth? But through studying the Bible, I understood God's calling in my life, that it was to be a light and help others to truly know Christ. Sometimes we can look back on our life and just question, why me? Why did I experience those things? If God's all powerful, why didn't he protect me? And that was me at times. Not completely understanding why I went through certain things that I went through. Even at times, I would blame God for things that people did. And I came to a deep conviction out of Romans 8:28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. I began to look at everything through the lens of God's love. God loves you. Everything he does is because he loves you. He wants nothing more than to be with you for eternity in heaven. The book of Esther teaches us that God is never absent in our lives. He is committed to you. Are you committed to him? Esther's story restores our hope that God has an important purpose for us all, no matter who we are or what our past looks like, but we must claim our crown. And that is the second thing I want to talk about tonight. Claiming your crown, finding your purpose. When Esther decides to courageously face her fear and rely on God, her true beauty as queen was found. The bold transformation of Esther was not cosmetic, but it sprang from the core of her being. Esther didn't swoon. She knew what she had to do. She stepped out and she took risk. She was empowered by God to save a nation. And in one decisive moment, she was a force to be reckoned with. God had a call upon her life. He allowed Esther to be in a position that compelled her to become bold and courageous and to take ownership of her personal calling. She had to defend her nation. She protected the king from the wicked counsel of Haman by exposing Haman. She ended the threat to the Jews. In Esther 9 verse 22 it says, "As the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration, he wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy and giving presents to one another and gifts to the poor." On the day the Jewish nation was supposed to be annihilated, it became a day of celebrating God's power in their lives. Esther was a leading participant in saving God's people. Esther's metamorphosis brought her to a place of courage and wisdom, using her life and her talents for God. She found her purpose. Exodus 9 verse 16 says, "I have raised you up for this very purpose, that I might show you my power and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth." God raised her up to save people and make God's name great. She was created for this. This was her calling as a woman, to wage war against the enemies of God and to fight for his kingdom and his people. The book of Esther invites us to see that God can and does work in the real mess of human history. Esther's story touches the outer fringes of women's value and purpose. At her lowest point, she is rounded up like cattle with the other girls without regard to her as a person. At her highest point, she sat at the apex of world power and had influence over international affairs. Her story is truly big enough to contain every woman's story. And I believe we can find ourselves in the book of Esther. Esther 4 verse 14 says, "Who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" It is amazing to think that God works like that behind the scenes in our lives too. That he is advancing his purposes through us despite our weaknesses. God uses the faithfulness of people to accomplish his purpose. 1 Peter 2 verse 9 says, "But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light." God chooses you. He chooses you and he is committed to you. Commit to him. Study the Bible. Understand what it means to truly give your whole life to God and find your purpose within God's will. I am inspired by women who are willing to be brought out of darkness of their lives and to share the light of God. Women I know who are following in Esther's footsteps, fighting for God's kingdom, bringing love, bringing mercy, bringing truth and justice to a dark world. James 1 verse 12 says, "Blessed is the one who perseveres. Having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him." Esther's crown was so much more than a piece of metal and some precious stones. Her true crown was the crown of eternal life that she received for herself and her nation. Esther's story awakens us to God's message for us today, to be willing to face our fears and live out God's purpose for our lives. Thank you so much for joining me for this Esther series. I pray that you are inspired. I have been so inspired to share the book of Esther with you, but I pray you're inspired to follow in Esther's footsteps, to go to God, to be bold, and to live your life for God's purpose. My email address is below, and if you are interested in studying the Bible or furthering God's purpose in your life or giving your whole life to God, I would love to study the Bible with you or direct you in the right way. The Bible is incredible, and it will absolutely transform your life so you can live this life of courage and power that Queen Esther lived to save a nation. Have a great night.